Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session of Revise as Pro conducted by Uplift Pro. As you all know, that this session has been specifically crafted for all the aspiring CMA students with a perspective that to help them in the revision process. And myself is Amitabo. I'm the lead faculty for US CMA and the US CPA courses from Uplift. So, a part of the Revise as Pro, today we'll be covering a topic from internal controls, which is in section E, part 1 of our CMA syllabus, and it has a weightage of 15%. Previously, we had a session already around the COSO framework, and in a continuation of that particular session, we'll try to cover around specific important areas of the internal control risks, the type of controls, how to undertake the assessment, and what is the mitigation approaches for the internal control risks. So let's get started and progress ahead. So firstly, as I say always, that we should know that what are the areas that we need to cover when we are revising with a perspective that what can be asked in the examination, because that is the main objective, that we need to cross the line. So as we have a structure in the US CMA, so the MCQs as well as the essay questions may come around. Specifically for MCQ, we should be keeping in mind that there might be certain MCQs that will test us around the the internal control risks, then the type of controls, and also the assessment and mitigation strategies. And there might be even essay questions around what would be the ideal strategy to take, what can be the mitigation approaches. So it's very important that we as students are clear about the different types of controls, the different ways to mitigate the risks. Let's move ahead with the key things that we need to remember from this particular area. So let us see what are the key points. So from this particular section, we should be keeping in mind that one of the key things from an internal control perspective is the objectives to achieve. And we have said that the objectives are ORC, which speaks about operating effectiveness, reliability of financial reporting, and also compliance with laws and regulations. Now, if these are the objectives that the internal control should reasonably achieve, then what is the situation of a internal control risks? It is a situation that basically what happens is that any of the objectives may not be met. So when any objective is not achieved, then that particular situation is termed as the internal control risks. And the likelihood of an internal control failure is basically a function of inherent risks and the control effectiveness. This should be kept in mind. Now, when we say inherent risks, it is basically the risk which is inherent to the nature of the business. And so basically it happens that in case there is no controls, then what is the control failures that might arise in that particular situation, which we are defining as the inherent risks? And it may occur because of on the basis of how a company operates or how a business decision has been taken. So if you take a quick example, might be in a small restaurant which might be dealing with a lot of cash transactions, there is a possibility that the cash may be mishandled. So that is like a inherent risk to the business. And this type of risks can come from inside the business, which like an employee fraud, or outside, like due to competition of government regulations. So moving ahead to the next important area is that in case we are finding the situation of internal control failures that might be happen, what is the ways of bringing control effectiveness? So controls can be classified into different ways, but the three types of controls that we all should keep in mind, remember the three letters PDC. And what does it stand for? It stands for, firstly, in terms of P, that is the preventive controls. D stands for detective controls, and C stands for the corrective controls. Now, what is the preventive controls? It is basically the controls which are designed to provide a reasonable assurance that only the valid transactions are recognized, approved, and submitted for processing. So it is something which is kept at the very beginning when the processing is happening. So any errors gets detected at that point of time only. So some examples might be like the segregation of duties, passwords which are used, the CCTV which is installed, balance checks, or the credit limits. So these are basically the preventive controls. Talking about detective controls, as the name says, so it detects, so designed to provide reasonable assurance that errors or irregularities are discovered and corrected on a timely basis. So it is basically after a process has happened, there is some mechanism through which the errors will get detected timely. Example might be an error report, the bank reconciliation statement, the physical count of assets, monitoring controls, and incident logs. Finally comes the corrective controls. So the corrective controls is something like that is implemented after something is discovered as a part of the detective controls process. So something which actually helps to reduce the errors which has been found through the detective controls. So it's like a follow-up controls implemented post errors detected by the detective controls. And examples can be the incident response plans, the root cause analysis, etc. So you as students have to keep in mind the difference between these three type of controls, because there might be very twisting questions in MCQs where you have to answer what type of controls it is. So if your concept is clear, then only you'll be able to answer that. Coming into the point that when we have learned these three controls, then there should be a proper efficient combination of the preventive, detective, as well as the corrective controls, which is implemented in a way that they can effectively address the inherent risks. The purpose is that we are required to have the controls designed in such a way that the inherent risks can be eliminated, it can be reduced. So this is one of the important areas that we should keep in mind. Moving ahead, what can be the next important thing is about the internal control risk assessment and the mitigation strategies. So let us see what we need to remember from this particular area. So firstly, here, we should keep in mind that what is the internal control risk? It is a function of likelihood and the potential for loss. So, what is the likelihood that is a happening of the internal control risks, and what is the potential loss that may arise in case the internal control risk is happening? And we should try to assess basically how costly that control failure might be. So, that assessment is required. And I think this is an area from where generally a strategy question may come as a part of your essay, where you may be asked to respond to different situations, that what can be the mitigation approaches you can devise. And for that, I think the next point that we should keep in mind is a risk matrix, which is used to mitigate the internal control risks. And how this matrix works, if we all look into, is that, see, if there is a low likelihood of the internal control risks to arise and the potential loss is also low, then it is fine to accept the risks. The organization can accept the risks, right? But when the likelihood of the internal control risk is low, but there is a high chances of a potential loss, a loss is going to be highly impactful, then it is better to take a insurance. Then coming to the bottom left corner, where there is a high likelihood of the internal control risk, but the potential loss is low, then we can somewhere have the controls in place to check the situation. Finally, in a last quadrant, where we see that there is a high likelihood as well as a high potential loss, now, this is a situation that a business should actually avoid, because that is not something suitable for the business to progress. So keep in mind this matrix, because different situations may be thrown to you in the examination and you have to state the appropriate mitigation strategy that is to be applied. Then the next point that should be kept in mind is that how to test the effectiveness of internal controls, right? So there are different methodologies. I will suggest remember the acronym IREO, because that will help you to remember the processes which are in place, like inquiry, R for reperformance, then I again for inspection, and finally observation. And remember, when we are saying that we are testing the controls over a period of time or periodically, it is like the monitoring activity that forms a part of our COSO framework. It's a component of the COSO framework, monitoring. And this is something which is told here, that we should be somewhere monitoring the internal controls over periodically to see whether they are operating effectively or not. And what are the processes? IREO. Keep that in mind. With that, I'll move into the next part, which might be important area for this section, is the limitation of internal controls. As you all know, that internal controls which in place provides a reasonable assurance. It does not guarantee that every error or fraud will get detected, but it gives a reasonable assurance. So what are the limitations? You may be given any particular situation and you may be asked to find out what is the type of limitation, or you may be given an essay question around to tell about the limitations of internal control. So let's see what are the limitations. First, management override of controls. Now this is something where the management itself dilutes their responsibility towards the controls. That is, they are themselves violating the controls. They are not following that. So if the top management disregards, then naturally we cannot say the employees to follow it. So that's the point. Human bias and errors. So I think there is always some form of manual intervention or errors that might happen, which is beyond the control. So that's the second point. Collusion of individuals. Now, this is something which comes up from the aspect of segregation of duties. We know that is very important for business functions to operate effectively in an organization. The important functions like that of approval, custody, as well as recording should be given to different individuals, because that's the principle of segregation of duties. But if it so happens that people who have been given different responsibilities like that of approval or custody, they collide among themselves, they actually themselves come together, in that situations the controls will become ineffective. So that is the collusion of individuals. Then the fourth point, conflict of interest, is another thing that might become a internal control limitation. And finally, the cost benefit trade off. When we say the cost benefit trade off, so whenever we are installing any controls, whenever we're placing a control, there is a cost involved and the relative benefit that we are going to gain from having the control. Now if the cost exceeds the benefit, then the organization will not be somewhere interested to implement that. So that also is a challenge. So it's very important that there should be a proper balance between the cost and benefit for the organizations to take it forward to implement the controls. So I think these are the main areas we should keep in mind in terms of the internal control risks, then the assessment and mitigation, and also the type of controls that might be asked in the examination. I hope that this particular small video was helpful for you. And if you are interested to know more, please follow the Uplift platform for the upcoming Revision as Pro videos. Thank you.